Hello lovelies, and welcome to Off Topic Tuesday. While I don't put a lot of my politics into most of my games, politics and history are passions of mine, and occasionally I do like to at least talk politics from my perspective. Everyone's going to be talking about Orange Julius Caesar today, but I don't really want to talk about him. But I do want to talk about something that he represents, which is a total and abject failure of the left to even be on the political agenda, really, in a lot of countries. It wasn't always like this. Bernie Sanders is the closest thing the US has to a truly left-wing politician, and he was pretty popular for a while there. Jeremy Corbyn in this country was also very popular with a lot of people for a while, carrying an old-school left-wing message for the most part, and he was similarly betrayed by both his own flaws and the political, social and media setup in this country. We're in such a state that very few people even consider left-wing solutions viable, despite their material and real success in other countries. People seem to think that left-wing means Rick from The Young Ones, a useless, overly right-on prat, whose only activity really seems to be calling other people fascist. And even when they are, it's possibly not the best thing to point it out, at least politically. People wonder why I reject the modern left as the pseudo-left, and that's really why. They have almost no characteristics of left-wing ideology or philosophy, and instead have deeply upper-middle-class and financially well-off concerns, which alienates them from the working class and underclass, while also rendering them and the actually wealthy elite mutually hostile, and one side of that argument has more money and thus a bigger club. The political left in English-speaking countries has faced several challenges and failures since 2008, and has squandered the opportunities it has been given since that date. Now, I don't think anyone will listen to me. I know a lot of my audience does not share my politics, and I don't think that I can change anything, and I'm not really proselytizing so much as just organizing my own thoughts. But if other people do the same here, and there's enough of them, then maybe eventually we can snowball into something better happening in the future. I mean, the left is actually pretty good at big projects when it wants to be. The NHS, the New Deal, public housing, infrastructure, all kinds of big shit that we're capable of doing. But the biggest task that faces us right now is reforming the left itself. Despite a focus on wealth redistribution and social welfare, the left has often struggled to present solutions that capture the public imagination, even though, again, they have a proven track record in many times, many countries, especially in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Even countries with successful socialist economies, such as the Nordic countries, shy away from that description for some reason. It's as though the collapse of communism, not that any of those states were actually communist, or nor that that's necessarily the end result of socialism, but it's as though those discredited all left-wing or mixed economy economics, when again you can look back to the Scandinavian countries and see enormous success of social democracies, success that has nothing to do with racial homogeny, before some white supremacist starts up in the comments. Perceptions of elitism in the gall that currently wears the left as a skin suit have also grown, with critics accusing left-wing parties of prioritising urban, educated, middle-class voters and issues over working-class concerns. There's some validity to that, of course, but a university education and a medium income does not an elite make. These are the core voters of the modern pseudo-left, whose concerns they have to appeal to retain their core and their base within urban centres. And anything beyond that feels like a riskier prospect, a group of people who are as likely to vote for the far right as they are for the left, who are distasteful to this core demographic because of their common racism, xenophobia, and social conservatism. So it seems like they're a risky group to try and appeal to because their concerns are often accurately described in those negative lights. But there is no attempt to persuade or to change their mind or to show them the positives of the things they've been told to be against. The right does not care about economic inequality, and while they're fine with wealth redistribution, it's only the case when the wealth travels from the poor to the rich, and not vice versa. So it's not that they're against wealth redistribution. This could be addressed by full-throated support for something like universal basic income, funded by progressive taxation and wealth taxes. Yeah, the tax burden goes up, but something like a UBI can all but eliminate poverty, and the redistributive effect is a huge economic boon due to the velocity of money. Poor people tend to spend faster. It also makes elder and childcare more viable, and makes creative and educational careers more viable, more charity work more viable, and so on, along with other marginal work that otherwise still needs to be done. There have been many trials of UBI to almost unqualified success, so why are we still pussyfooting around about this, or about more flexible and home working? Why? It's a weird one. Neoliberalism. It's an old word, really, because it's neither particularly liberal nor particularly new. But many leftist, or at least more to the left than to the right, parties and groups continue to embrace it or fail to challenge neoliberal economic presumptions and frameworks, which further alienates traditional working class voters who used to vote left. The left's inability to create a cohesive alternative economic vision has hampered their ability to counteract conservative propaganda. There's a lack of effort to educate people on the few alternatives that have been presented and which seem to work and make sense, and they're difficult things to convey to people. Counterintuitive. A failure to create class solidarity has caused the right's criticism of globalism to swamp the left-wing idea of internationalism, which is the alternative, really, and sets people against each other fighting over scraps when they should be unifying to get more. Almost as if it's by design, but it needn't be. There are alternatives, such as establishing strong public-focused industrial policies, such as local and home renewable energy projects subsidised by central government, owned and managed by local communities themselves as part of a greater localization of politics generally, again, modified on successful Nordic models. Renewable technology and other high-tech solutions, such as agricultural robots, home turbines, solar, 3D printing, and further rollout of high-speed internet can create much more resilient local economies that are much more able to cope with local disasters and problems. Energy, food production, even manufacturing can all continue despite disruption if you are set up to do that. Post-COVID, more of us than ever are working from home, and IT and power infrastructure at a local level helps that continue. In this day and age, most people don't need to be in an office, and cutting out the commute helps deal with pollution, leaves more money in people's pockets, a de facto pay rise for most, and any loss of socialization and so on can be compensated for by the additional free time that it opens up. And having local democracies, local industry, local power, local everything helps encourage people into that more localized democratic structure. So there's really no reason not to do this other than tradition and a power trip on behalf of bosses. But there's no reason we shouldn't do that. I can't speak so much to other countries, but the UK's housing crisis is a time bomb that we've had ticking away since the advent of the right to buy scheme, a hideously short-sighted policy brought in under Margaret Thatcher that cut into social housing, leading to the shortages of social housing that we have today and the lack of incentive for local councils to build and provide more of it. It seems that nobody is interested in building affordable housing at the kind of scale that we need, at least, because affordable doesn't seem to mean profitable to people. So neither government nor private industry is providing what people need because there is no incentive to provide that. Meanwhile, speculators and landlords buy up what housing stock there is and sit on it, either as an investment or to charge exorbitant rents at a level where nobody really has any choice, and which weirdly is often higher than a mortgage payment would be, but despite people's ability to pay exorbitant rents over years, they're not considered a safe enough bet for a mortgage. The left has been far too timid on this, wanting to stay credible with the financial class and their money, more importantly. Still, there are things we could do, and more people would be for them than against them. Rent controls, mandated affordable housing building quotas, repeal the right to buy scheme. With so much property lying vacant, used by speculators, we could always seize it or engage in asset forfeiture. I mean, for example, we could just nick anything the Russians own at the moment and dump it into London's housing supply. That would have a big effect. Use the proceeds from this to fill that fiscal black hole that we have. Open up more possibilities for cooperative community builds, more self-builds and tech-integrated and low-carbon housing. Provide incentives and subsidies to do so. People with no connection, no buy-in, no stakehold, which here in the UK often comes in the form of owning property, they have nothing to lose. No reason to feel like they're participating or have anything to hope for in the broader society, and are less likely to have children and so on because they don't have a secure roof over their heads, and so they are then more likely to take risky and dangerous political and social decisions, such as voting for extremist parties. So it's in all our interests to ensure that there is a decent basic standard of living with a roof over your head. Identity politics is a big personal bugbear of mine. I've seen it tear apart causes, hobbies, culture, all sorts of things that I really care about, but its greatest effect has perhaps been felt in the political sphere. Many argue, and I would agree, that the left has over-prioritized identity politics at the expense of class/wealth-based solidarity. And I think they're absolutely right. The ideal of the left is supposed to be that everyone is of equal worth and rights. So if you simply invert a hierarchy, it's still an unfair and uneven hierarchy. and it's holding people alive today accountable for things that their ancestors did, which is religious thinking. Many of these identitarian concerns also lack any real historical or scientific rigor behind them. It's feelings, it's postmodern. And identitarianism involving race or nationality, things that are essentially meaningless in the real world, are more often the province of the extreme right. So engaging in that kind of identity politics only feeds your opposition. Competing identities have split the broader movement and set people against one another, as it always does. This is something that, again, should be antithetical to traditional left-wing values. So we should reframe identity issues within a broader class narrative, that of shared struggle, shared problems, empathy, compassion, things that we share, emphasizing how systemic hierarchies oppress all people and how people have more in common than things that divide them. Fostering a more horizontal, localized democracy also helps smooth this out and allows groups to see each other as people that they can deal with and engage with on a personal basis rather than some faceless demographic collection of axes to grind. It also wouldn't hurt to regulate social media, or at least to provide incentives or alternatives, algorithms that give greater priority to positive, uplifting, common interactions rather than hatred and fighting and engagement through negativity. There could also be more emphasis on the progress that we have made and the battles we have won in liberating ourselves and other people and expanding their rights, rather than focusing on long-dead oppressions. The left has often appeared reactive rather than proactive when it comes to culture debates, ceding ground to the right in areas such as free speech and patriotism. Free speech has traditionally, always previously, been a left-wing value, because it has tended to be things associated with the left that have outraged public morals and which have needed to be defended. Patriotism, less so, because of the belief in progress and improvement, and thereby the left is often critical, but also wants what's best or better for everybody in the nation. So that is a spin on patriotism that might be taken. The right has hijacked free speech from the left in recent years, because the identitarianism of the modern pseudo-left has encouraged a certain censorious impulse. And now that the right wields the cultural whip, they seem to think that they can revert to their old ways and start censoring others, despite having benefited, just as the left used to, from a more absolutist commitment to free expression and free speech. Now we're getting it from both sides. Unfortunate, but it's something perhaps we should and could reclaim. Attempts to combat misinformation and extremist narratives have consistently backfired, reinforcing polarization rather than censorship or control or fact-checking that just gets ignored or dismissed. It might be better to take a view of proven strategies about educating people on how to assess media, how to avoid propaganda, give them the skills that they can then apply. This has been done in some countries as part of education. It takes longer, but it does seem to mean you have a healthier society long term with less conspiracy theorists, less effective propaganda, and a more educated and informed populace who know to stop and check things first. Promoting a unifying, positive cultural narrative rooted in common values, freedom, justice, and equality, could also help here, appealing to people's better natures, encouraging them to humanize others rather than to dehumanize them and blame and hate them. Independent media and art collectives, centrally funded, such as similar ways to we have the license fee in the UK, but less bounded by government, could help here. Properly funded and with better incentive structures, they could provide platforms that challenge ideological and corporate-owned media on a more even footing. Though the transition from large-scale media companies to granular talking head and internet news that we're going through challenges that as an approach. And so this will likely need a lot more thought. The left has frequently struggled to articulate its policies in accessible, compelling ways, often appearing technocratic or overly academic. And I'm acutely aware of my own tendency to be grandiloquent. Not that there's anything wrong with technocracy in its literal meaning. Government by experts sounds like a pretty good idea compared to the way things have been a lot of the time. But you still have to be able to sell it to people. The left can't meme, as they say, though this wasn't always the case. But realistic solutions often require good communications or are too complex and nuanced to be reduced to a soundbite or a slogan, which are all disadvantages which the left has. Slogans and so on are much more the province of the right. There has to be a better way to communicate these ideas in the way that we used to be able to, with classic phrases like "you have nothing to lose but your chains," things like that. They come across hackneyed now because they're so old, but it's not that we always couldn't meme. But there has to be a better way to communicate these ideas somehow, and you would think with so many humanities and communications graduates we'd be able to figure out what that was. Unfortunately, too many activists just palm people off with "educate yourself" or "it's not my job to educate you." Yes, it fucking is. You're supposed to be an activist. You're supposed to persuade people of your ideas, or to at least make the attempt. The left should, it does, have access to more youthful activists who understand technology and so on better, at least hypothetically on paper. But the problem is that many of the most enthusiastic are completely insufferable. The more motivated are the last people you would want communicating with anybody. Parties and organisations could, however, easily do better. There are successful left-wing influencers, personalities and groups, but the ones that should be focused on are the ones that manage to reach out to other people. The left may be hobbled by its relative honesty, relative, and unwillingness to just openly bullshit people. In that may hobble it, at least as long as the right doesn't have any hang-ups about doing so. And I don't know that should change, because in the longer term, honesty is a good policy. But media-savvy messaging could help a great deal, as well as more, not less, involvement in social media. Left-wing policies are often wildly popular, even while left-wing parties and activists might not be. But these policies are not communicated or are not joined up with the parties or the activist groups, or even offered because of timidity and fear of the moneyed classes. This is especially true in the US, but not only there by any stretch. Infighting between progressive and centrist or corporate factions has weakened the left's effectiveness and unity in several countries, the US Democratic Party and the UK Labour Party especially. High-profile splits and leadership backstabbing have weakened electoral prospects and public trust. In most nations, the broader left is the majority, but is split between numerous factions, and especially in countries with first-past-the-post electoral systems such as the UK, and US, this kind of shuts them out from being truly represented in power. In the UK, that could be partially solved through electoral reform, but otherwise it requires compromise, deep compromise, and agreement that keeping out the right-wing alternative is more important than absolute ideological purity to the goals of each and every party. There are shared goals, so concentrate on those and fight for a greater say in the broader coalition in those reformed elections. Of course, to get those electoral reforms, you have to unite long enough to push them through. A more radical solution, even than that, would be to embrace more direct democracy, so that even without formal left-wing political parties winning, popular left-wing policies could be passed and embraced by the populace as a whole. Again, as we've seen happen in the US, where often particular measures are put on the ballot alongside elections. Though, of course, if you do that, you then also run the risk of the far right also pushing through what amounts to many, many mini Brexits, which is probably the last thing anybody needs. Governments led by leftist parties, when that happens, they often fail to deliver on transformative policies, such as healthcare reform or climate action, due to either bureaucratic inertia or overly compromising, or misguided attempts at cross-party cooperation, again, particularly in the States. That's a fine and noble thing to attempt, but when the other side is absolutely steadfast in its refusal to cooperate in any way, it's a pointless endeavour, and you have to go ahead and do things yourself. Part of Corbyn's downfall was that he overpromised to the level that people didn't believe him about the policies that he was suggesting. Part of Starmer's problem is that the Labour Party under Starmer has essentially promised absolutely nothing, which has kept expectations low, perhaps, but even in spite of this, they're being punished for seeming to not do very much. That's not especially fair, because they are doing more than they promised, which was nothing. But again, their communication is bad, and they have the majority of the right-wing UK media establishment against them, which never helps a left-wing party in power. Democracy is awful at long-term planning and execution of big ideas, and Starmer's Labour is putting a lot of stock in the idea that their policies will begin to be felt and noticed and correctly attributed with success by the time of the next election. Meanwhile, their short-term policies, despite often being holdovers from the previous far-right Conservative government, are leading to terrible approval statistics. And yet, paradoxically, they couldn't have been elected if they hadn't moderated their stance to such a huge degree. There needs to be a mix, I think, of smaller, immediately achievable goals that better the lives of the majority in small but visible ways, in order to buy time for a broader transformational vision to bed in and start to take effect. Small things rebuild trust in government through incremental success towards some particular end, and buys you the time you need to do the bigger things. More localized democracy would again help here, with decisions being taken as close to the ground, as close to the local level as possible, so everyone can see democracy and government working where they are. Instances of leaders or prominent party members not living up to their professed values is a big problem, particularly for left-wing parties. When they do things like tacitly or explicitly support austerity measures, or fail to act or vote on climate change mitigation measures, All of these kind of things and more personal failings undermine left-wing credibility far more than they undermine right-wing credibility, because the right generally, except when it comes to religion, doesn't pretend to be good people. In fact, a lot of their appeal seems to be embracing the worst aspects of humanity and providing excuses for it. So the left is kind of uniquely vulnerable on this, or almost uniquely vulnerable on this, which yet again isn't fair, but it's the reality, and so it has to be dealt with as it is, not how you wish it would be. In one stark and very recent example, Trump is now promising to save TikTok and is getting a lot of praise for it, despite being the motherfucker who started off the banning process and championed it until quite recently in the first place. Yet he doesn't appear to be being punished for it. Changing one's mind is, however, different to being a hypocrite or a political windsock, and that's an important distinction that must come with acknowledgement and explanation of the change of heart. Being willing to change your mind is actually a strength, but in politics you tend to get punished for it, and that's a culture that needs to change. It is sadly true that trust built up over an extended period can be lost in a moment. It takes a long period of spotless behaviour to rebuild that trust, something that I think the media also needs to learn as a lesson. As such, there's not a lot that can be done other than being absolutely resolute and overly cautious in one's principles and the way in which one lives one's life, politically and personally, and ensuring that the rules are enforced. Perhaps this can be done through increased accountability within leftist organisations, through transparency measures perhaps, but again, the problem is that only political wonks will actually care to check through the transparency process. To take another recent example, the difference between the relatively minor gifts that Starmer has been given by various lobbyists, companies, groups and organisations, the stuff that the right is shrieking about, the difference between those and the gifts that right-wing figures have often been given under the table is that Starmer followed the rules and registered his gifts and declared them all on a public register, while the right-wing politicians didn't do that. So he has followed the rules and done everything according to how things should be, but is copping flack for it in a way that the people that broke the rules haven't, precisely because he has been more publicly accountable. It's not fair, but it's the way things are, and whatever the rules are, if you're on the left, you have to stay whiter than white, cleaner than clean from any perception of sleaze in a way that the right doesn't. Again, not fair, but it's the way things are. And most of the public don't give a toss that he followed the rules as they are, just that there is this appearance, albeit much more petty and small scale, of impropriety. The rise of populism has caught the left very much off guard, even though it's been going on for quite some time now. And it's left them with inadequate strategies to counter the appeal of far-right populists. To my mind, the problem is that, as ever, the far-right seems to feel free to promise the moon on a stick to anyone who will listen, and at least they have the rhetoric of addressing people's issues, even if they don't have the policies or the ideas, or even worse, their policies or ideas would make things, well, worse. But they give the appearance of wanting to help people with their day-to-day problems, even if their solutions are cruel nonsense that will harm big swathes of people and are known not to work. It doesn't seem to matter. The fact is that they are at least appearing to address people's problems. And the current pseudo-left doesn't offer any solutions to these issues, even rhetorically, or at least doesn't appear to offer any solutions. So how can we ask people to support us when they're concerned with the lower part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, while the trust fund kids are concerned with the top end. The left has often failed to craft narratives that effectively resonate, particularly in this post-truth era that's dominated by social media. While rightfully the left doesn't really want to engage in the same dishonest tactics and casual cruelty that the right does, blaming vulnerable minorities, that's not something we want to do. There must be a way to create a better narrative that has more appeal, because by and large most people either aren't bigots and racists or don't want to believe that they're bigots and racists. So giving them a way to be good people and deal with their issues seems like a win-win. The left, at least the old school left, does have a rhetoric of empowerment, liberation, solidarity and unity, which despite various handicaps still seems to me to be an easier sell than reactionary nationalism. There's also possibilities in re-embracing the promise of the early utopian internet, of dissolving traditional borders and divisions by forming friendship groups and international organizations to humanize and bind people together over mutual values across borders, and to mobilize internationally against the oligarch-backed far-right groups that are already organizing internationally. One thing I've always found particularly baffling is that how globalism, which is really international capitalism, is something that has become associated with the left rather than the actual left-wing international philosophy, which is internationalism, and that many of the people who claim to be anti-globalism are financially backed by oligarchs and billionaires who benefit from and drive globalism and globalization. None of this makes any sense. Many leftist parties were slow to address the negative effects of globalization on domestic industries and jobs and so on, even though it is wildly overstated, and therefore have lost ground to populists who exploit these grievances, however overblown they might be, even though the solutions that the right wing offers will actually make things much worse for everybody. The left has also failed to play up the positives, to explain how and why immigration can be good or necessary, unfortunately, given our population demographics by age, for example, or have failed to show how global infrastructure helps keep things affordable and improves everyone's lifestyles. It's also failed to promote and expand on the competing version of global concerns, that internationalism. Current globalization is something of a hybrid between the two points of view, but we could stand for having a bit more internationalism. The strangest part of this is, as I said, the far right being anti-globalist while also being in the pocket of the billionaire class. Make it make sense. Expanded advocacy for fair trade policies and local job creation could help. Subsidize industries if necessary so that local production of globally produced goods, everything that we can produce, can be continued at some level locally in case of global disruptions to the supply chain. You could also use this to rapidly expand green tech industries and cooperative enterprises that cut out all the middlemen and the management class and make businesses fairer and more competitive. Extreme local production through use of data and light/cottage level industry can also help here, especially made better with laser sintering machines, 3D printing and so on, and that can, as I mentioned earlier, make nations more resilient in cases of natural disaster, issues around global supply and demand and so on, evening things out and becoming incorporated with the same sort of localized democracy that I'm also advocating for here. Right-wing parties and movements have often massively outpaced the left in using social media platforms to mobilise support, influence public opinion, shape cultural narratives internationally, while paradoxically being extremely nationalistic for the most part. Racist movements in different countries all seem to agree that they don't like foreigners and are willing to work with foreigners to promote that message. Again, make it make sense. Many of them also use subterfuge, hidden propaganda, encrypted networks, and so on to organise themselves, and again, weirdly, they tend to have the backing of the oligarchs, or at least the tech oligarchs that we have at the moment. The left has comparatively been slow on the uptake, or has been too unwilling, or perhaps more positively, too principled to fight on an even level, believing in the institutions and the unwritten rules in a way that the right and the far right don't. It is possible, I think, even without sinking so low, to do better at creating digital campaigns, organisations and structures that emphasise accessibility and authenticity, that help to build solidarity across cultural and geographical borders by using tech to amplify left-wing groups and voices in a positive way. And one thing that we do have going for us is that the left-wing point of view is more publicly acceptable and thus less susceptible to overt censorship, at least, than far-right views. I mean, the right now has a virtual clean sweep of the major social media platforms, and this is a problem, as some of these places are less overtly censoring left-wing voices and values. On X, you can get shadow banned for expressing left-wing points of views, or you can simply be swamped by bots and negative talk. And then there's the excesses of the particularly insufferable activist wing, haranguing people constantly, which turns them off and drives them into the arms of the opposition. Decentralized platforms like Mastodon are too small to compete without the popular appeal of something like X, so you're just preaching to the converted. And even the more open alternatives like Blue Sky have just become the mirror universe doppelganger of the far-right elements of X. Still, we need competitors, perhaps state-funded but autonomously run social media platforms, like a sort of participatory BBC with a more hands-off charter. You can't really force change on social media given its bottom-up nature, even with some sort of legal cudgel. So this relies on acquiring a critical mass of activists and them not being dickheads. So I'm not that hopeful on that score. But I'm an anarchist, right? And so a lot of these solutions and so on involve government, albeit a more localized government, right? Which in large part goes against my ideals. But what my anarchism manifests as is a desire for the greatest amount of freedom and the greatest fulfillment of potential for the greatest number of people. And I'm willing to compromise those ideals, even if they're my compass pointing me in a particular direction. So a lot of these solutions are compromises from my rather extreme ideals, because they get us closer to my ideals, even by using methods that I don't necessarily ideologically think a great deal of, but it's closer to what I want. And if I can compromise from my extreme, then I think other people can compromise from their extremes. But unfortunately, the right has dragged the Overton window so far over that even obvious, well-tested solutions, such as many of those that I offer here, but not all of them, are now outside of the Overton window. They're not seen as remotely viable, even though many of them are being practiced in other nations. We know that the left has a better, more resonant message when it comes to policy. It just fails to communicate it. The public image of the left is some insufferable vegan bugging you while you're trying to eat a ham sandwich. You know, the least tolerant people, the most upper middle class and out of touch elements. You know, that's the public face of the left at the moment. And their fixation upon negative messaging, nagging people, insufferable activism, swamps all the very real, practical and tested left-wing ways to address crime, poverty, homelessness and other everyday real-world problems. The competing popular messages, minus the self-loathing baggage of the trust fund kids, that's what needs to be promoted. Competing messages and platforms need to be crafted. We need to be cleaner than clean, whiter than white in our political dealings, while punching back and getting a little bit more dirty when it comes down to important political fights, and to stop trying to reach out to people who will never, ever agree with us. When we do have power, we need to do things with it, and quickly. It's telling that even while in a powerful political position, the left in the US and in the UK hasn't really seemed to have been able to do much with it. Obama being the biggest disappointment, while the far right, even with a slim majority, or even while being in a minority, has been able to fuck things up on a broad global scale relatively easily. I mean, the odds and the money are against the left, but the numbers aren't, if we can communicate effectively. I mean, look how far we've come. Look at how more equal our societies are, despite modern setbacks. Look at the great things we've achieved. Think about how much better even than this things could be for everyone. That is a good message. The idea that we're all guilty pieces of shit who wrecked the world and need to atone for it, and that isn't a good message. But shit ain't gonna change without effort. And this is a very small effort. Zang. There are certain kinds of people, ale-drinking people, people who did a little too much acid in the 60s, people who wear large warm jumpers and take long brisk walks in the countryside. These people maintain that fairies not only exist, but that they are very common. They also tend to believe that fairies are a countryside phenomenon, much like casual cruelty to animals, sexual intercourse with sheep, and having an impenetrable and parochial accent. This is, of course, rather wide of the mark. Fairies have always had a strong relationship with man, darning his socks, cobbling his shoes, cleaning his houses, drowning him, marrying him, and swapping his children for malformed hydrocephalics as a bit of a jape, and otherwise aiding or demeaning the efforts of man. Fairies do not need our belief to exist, they need us and the things that we leave around. Like an urban fox or the aerial rat known as the pigeon, if they survive they will have adapted to city life and found their niches, not in tending to flowers and trees, but in crashing computers, letting down the tyres on people's cars, and eating leftover pizza. Urban Fairy is a game of those kind of fairies, gone feral and urban, adapted to modern life. It's a comedy game of hijinks, weirdness and strangeness, and it almost runs itself. You want Urban Fairy Pocket Edition, which is revised and updated with better art and edited writing, and it's available from post-mort.com, DriveThruRPG and lulu.com.